welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian. Is that what I'm supposed to say?
Yes. I'm going to insert the laugh track right there.
Okay.
Yeah, boom. Anyway, so we're back in the Bible Bistro. We've taken a little bit of a break.
Yeah, it's Bistro East, though. Well, we've both been busy.
We've both been busy.
It's good stuff. It's all good stuff.
Brian, why don't you say what you've been busy with?
Well, last week I was in a doctoral class at Northern Seminary up in the western suburbs of Chicago, the far western outreaches of the suburbs of Chicago.
Yes.
Really met my cohort for the first time, really good group of guys, and so excited about that. And so we did a class with Matthew Bates, who has promised he's going to come on. Now, I finally seen him face to face. We've been pursuing him for some time, but he promises he's going to come on. He says they just did a move. They just moved house, and so he and his wife and the 7 children. So he said he can't do anything until July. That's
understandable.
We should be hearing from Matt Bates recently, writer of Gospel Allegiance and his
Beyond the Salvation Wars, his latest book,
which has had a little bit of a flame,
stirring the pot.
It started a war there a little bit with the Southern Baptist Convention and so forth.
But it's led to some great reading for both you and I.
Yeah.
Some great reading for you.
You're continuing in your classes.
Yeah, I'm continuing my classes right now. Which kind of a little bit leads into what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
But so I've been continuing my classes, and so summer's upon us. You're in school.
Right.
I'm in school, and so yes, we've had a little bit of a break here.
Some of the reading we've done, the 2-parter we did on that was for my class. The 2-parter we did on the Unseen Realm, which again, good book, and we've got some other books coming up, and maybe some other author interviews coming up too, hopefully. So
yes, all right. Well, so what are we going to talk about today, Brian?
Well, we're going to talk about the breaks in Scripture, and how that affects the way that we read them, how we read Scripture and so forth. So there's lots of ways we can think about this. And the first thing I want to just go back and historically say, when the texts were written as they are. So let me talk about the New Testament first, and then I'll just say a little bit about the Old Testament. When the New Testament was written, it was written essentially line for line with no breaks, no punctuation. That's just the way it was done. And people say, well, how can you read this? The more familiar you become with Greek, the more you realize how they did. They used a lot of conjunctions. Yes. That's why in Greek, there's a word kai, which means and. You see that a lot.
A lot.
There's a word de, which is a contrastive. So it's but. We would usually say but. And a lot of times they indicate the beginning of a sentence with one of those. But we have to make some decisions about that. Chapters and verses, though, are kind of a funny thing because they really were not added until a much later period of time. And so there were no chapter breaks. There were no verse breaks even. It was really sentence level is all you had. And so you had the whole discourse kind of written out. Now, the point is there's been things added since then, and I kind of want to talk about the different levels of that. So the first is on chapters and verses. Before that, let me say I wanted to say something about the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there are books and there are later texts that do sometimes indicate paragraphs or different breaks. In the Psalms, for example, we have clear breaks between the Psalms. Those chapters were already, quote unquote, those chapters were already there, right? Before this happened. But for most of the Bible, chapter breaks were not introduced until like the 1200s, until the 13th century. And that's when chapter breaks began to be introduced. The Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, what is his name? I wrote his name down. Stephen Langton was the guy who initially kind of made the chapter breaks. I heard an old joke, actually, if you remember Dr. Kirka.
Yes.
He always joked that he was doing it while he was on horseback. So it was wherever his pin came down on the horseback is where the chapter breaks were. I have not heard that he's
made that joke before.
So the point is sometimes they don't make much sense. They kind of seem random. And so that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Verses weren't added until the late 16th century. And like the end of the 16th century, and the very first Bible, I believe it was published, I didn't write this down, I think 1607 or so was when the Geneva Bible was published, and that was the first one that really had chapters and verses. So until then, and the whole reason that those were added was to make it easier to refer to a specific passage, right? And it is, right. John 3:16, we know how to look that up.
We all know how to find it very easily.
That kind of thing. So that's the reason chapters and verses were added. But then here's the thing I want you to think about. What other Bible do we know that in the early 17th century, like 1611, came out. It's the King James version.
Right.
And so that's why we get today in modern versions, and I know it bothers a lot of people, we have some sections, sometimes verses that are missing, and quote unquote missing, because our ability to understand the text has increased and that kind of thing. So anyway, there's chapters and verses. The other thing, and this is kind of what you wanted to talk about, was the idea of paragraphs. So why don't you say a little bit about paragraphs, and then I'll talk about sections.
Yeah. So what one of my assignments for my classes is we're trying to do a deep dive exegetical work on the book of Philippians. And so one of our assignments was we take the Nestle Aland 28, which is the 28th edition of the Greek New Testament.
And we call this, and this is going to be a little bit for some of you who don't know language at all. This is called the eclectic text.
Yes.
And what we mean by that is there's no one Greek manuscript out there that has this whole text. It's basically looking at the family of texts that we have. Well over 5,000 manuscripts now we have in the New Testament, and comparing them and using the science of textual criticism, which we talked about a little bit before, in order to determine what we believe is the original, what was in the original Greek manuscript that those were copied from.
So we got the Greek version of Philippians from the NA28, and we put on a chart, and we put like this paragraph. We looked at the paragraph breaks that this team had put into the NA28. Then we looked at another Greek version of this eclectic text called the UBS 5, and
United Bible Society is what UBS
and
stands
so
for.
we took, where did they put paragraph breaks? Then we took our whatever your favorite English version was and go like, what paragraph breaks did they put in?
Sure.
And then we looked at a commentary and go, well, how did they break up Philippians? And so we put them all on this chart, and you start to see like there's some weird paragraph breaks in some of these places. And then we had to evaluate and kind of go, how do these paragraph breaks affect how we understand the text? And so that was one of the things. There's something we'll talk about here in Philippians here in a little bit that was like, oh, that changes how you think. It makes a difference about how we think about this text and what's going on in it. So that was kind of what the spawn of this conversation was, is like, we don't have paragraph breaks are an artificial thing that we've kind of inserted.
They're an editorial decision is the way that I would put it. So you mentioned the Nestle Aland 28, or you've got the UBS 5. Those are additions of the Greek text that the editors of have to make the decision on paragraph breaks. So your English Bible that our listeners are reading, those will be editorial decisions as well. So, for example, the New International Version, which we often quote on this program, the paragraphs will have been decided by the editors, translators, the editors of those editions, and pretty much the paragraphs stay the same. Like if you get an NIV from NIV Study Bible from Zondervan, or let's say you buy the some other NIV. The one I'm using now is the super giant print NIV.
Old eyes.
Yeah. Those paragraphs should be the same in both of those editions. But there's another level I wanted to say something about, and that's the section breaks. So a lot of times in your English translations, you'll have a heading that will say, here's a section of scripture, and will suggest this should all be read together. And those are actually decided by the edition that's being put out. So the study Bible might have a different section heading than the Supergiant print. Those are going to be decisions that are made at the editorial level as well. So we thought, let's think about some examples, and I've called this bad breaks, right? Where were these broken?
And I just want to say this as well, before we condemn, or not, it's not condemnation, but it's just like you talked about they use the word kai and the day. If you look at some of these ancient manuscripts, you look at them and it's just like it's a constant run-on of letters. Yeah. And so even, I've studied Greek. I'm not an expert here by any stretch of imagination, but you can go online and see these ancient texts, and you're like, how do you read this?
We don't want it, specific. 1 Peter chapter 1 is the example I always use, which is basically two long sentences, but the first sentence there is a huge long sentence in 1 Peter chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, we're going to look at a little bit later. Same kind of thing. It is. It's a decision that has to be made, but where that decision is made sometimes can make a difference. I'm going to refer our listeners back to an earlier episode we did of the podcast where we talked about John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38. And you might remember there, it was simply a matter where the punctuation was put in. So these are decisions that are made later. And the only thing is, and by the time we get to the end of the episode, we'll talk about how some things that we can do in order to help us think through these and make sure we're making good interpretive decisions when it comes to reading our Bible. So, it's difficult. We're not casting aspersions or dispersions. Which do we cast?
We're not
casting either of them.
We're casting aspersions of some nature.
And so we're not trying to say that at all. But it is something that I think is important for us to be aware of. So let's use some examples here. One of them we've talked about before in the podcast as well. This is an example of what I consider a bad section break. This is in John chapter 20.
Okay.
And it's verses 24 through 31, which is the account, you might remember, of Thomas. This is, we often call it doubting Thomas, right? Is what we have. And I had this, but then I pulled up something else because we were talking about something off. Oh, here we go. So what we have going on here is this is the second time Jesus appears to Thomas. Of course, we have the whole issue before about him not believing what had been told him by these other disciples who were with him. So I want to pick up. I'm going to start reading here in verse 24. And I don't remember. We'll put it in the show notes. We did do a whole episode talking about this. But now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." And then I talked about the importance of testimony, that here are his closest friends all together saying, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand at his side, I will not believe." And I want you to notice, again, I don't think doubting Thomas is a good thing to call him. I call him disbelieving Thomas, because he uses actually an emphatic form in the Greek here. It's the same thing where Jesus condemns this. He says, this generation will never believe unless they are shown signs, right? And so here he says, I will never believe. A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here," which is what Thomas had demanded. "See my hands. Reach out your hand and thrust it into my side. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Or again, it's apistuo. Stop disbelieving and believe. And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now, typically here, then we have a section break. So there's the Thomas episode. And then we have this kind of conclusion to the first part of the gospel anyway. But it goes on, it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe. Now, here's my only point, is when that section break is in there, sometimes we don't read this all as a unit. And I think what John is trying to do here, the author, the narrator, I sometimes will say, is inserting basically to say, Thomas had reason to believe based on the testimony he was given. I'm now giving you testimony, and you can be among those that Jesus say is blessed, who will believe without having seen. So Thomas serves in a sense as a negative example for the reader, where John is saying you don't have to have seen these things yourself. You have reliable testimony that can tell you about these things. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, by believing you have life in his name. So my whole point with this, when I've written on it and talked about it, is I think this should be understood as a unit. Section break again. And I even hear this sometimes read, like when we have scripture reading in church, they'll read the section heading, right? You got to remember, those are added by the editors of the edition. It's not even by the translators, right? It's by the editors of the edition of the Bible that you received. Again, they can be helpful guides, but certainly don't take them as quote unquote scripture, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Those section headings aren't a part of the original.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really one of the books that we've referenced here. And the author you're going to work to try to get on is Jason Staples. He's looking at some certain passages. And he's like, this doesn't, and he's making the case this doesn't say something. And I look in my Bible at the heading, and it's like in direct contradiction to what he's trying to make. And so, like, that's really, that's an important point here, is because it does flavor how you read a text if you're really focused on this.
And you've heard me say numerous times I call it the temple incident, right? But heading the temple cleansing, right?
Yep.
That is an interpretive decision that's already been made. And that's all we're saying is be careful and don't let those section headings that were added later guide you, is what we're trying to say. So here's another example. Matthew's chapters 24 and 25 are an example probably of a bad chapter break. Now, again, I'm going to remind you, this isn't because of your chapters and verses aren't because of your modern translations. These go back to the 13th century, right? These go back all the way to the Archbishop of Canterbury and his decision about where chapters should fall. So here's the interesting thing about chapter 24 of Matthew. If you have a red letter edition, you can see it's a long teaching of Jesus. It's about the second coming. It's about persevering until the return of the Messiah. So I'm just going to read some of this here in Matthew 24. Or did I have you reading it? I did.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Verse 45 says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It'll be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns." So you see the idea is this is talking about being faithful until you see Christ return. But suppose the servant is wicked and says to himself, "My master is staying away a long time." And then he begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect, very common theme, the idea of as a thief in the night, and at that hour he's not aware of, he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the idea of judgment. End of chapter
24.
Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at 25, it begins with the words in English. This is the NIV I'm reading from. "At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like the virgins who took their lamps." And here we have the story of the bridegroom. You might remember the midnight call comes and the bridegroom has come, and some have been found not prepared for the long wait. Now, that seems to go together pretty well, right? That seems to fit together. And there's not a therefore here. There's not any kind of a strong break. And yet, this is one of those examples where he was sitting on the horseback and the horse bucked and he put his pin down, and that was the end of chapter 24, beginning of chapter 25. So what difference does this make? It can help us to understand the broader context to say this is all basically one section of teaching that Jesus is doing here in this case.
This just reminds me how important or the difference of a reading culture versus an oral culture, and that, if you were just hearing this, just as you just kept reading, if no one said like, chapter 25, and they just kept reading, you'd be like, this story all goes together, like it builds on it. But when we sit down and read it, or we parse out and kind of go, I'm going to read verses from here to here, or someone says just read from here to here, you miss that whole piece of it. Like when they would recite this, it would be all of it.
There are Bibles out there, again, editions of Bibles out there that are called reader's editions that have taken out some of the verses, right?
But the chapters
are still there.
I have a reader version, and I've gone through that, and I really like it. But then the chapter markers are still there.
When I would teach Pauline epistles, or when I would teach Petrine epistles, a lot of times for certain books, I would hand out a text. I would essentially copy it from Logos. I would take out all of the versification, all of the chapter markings, and I would print it out for the students to read as a single unit. And again, what I was trying to get is exactly what you said. And I would say, you need to read this in one setting. Because, the chapter breaks, we say, oh, I can remember as a kid, I read 3 chapters today, right? And really what the idea is when this was heard, it would have been heard as a piece. It would have been heard all together. And what do you notice? I'll even give you the example. I had a friend, very good friend, who's unfortunately passed away tragically since then, but he had memorized the entire Sermon on the Mount, and he would recite that. And it was interesting when you heard that all together. I mean, think about it. The Sermon on the Mount's divided into 3 chapters, right?
Right.
When you hear that all together, you recognize this was a sermon. This was, and probably not an entire sermon, but the outline that Matthew gives us of a longer discourse that Jesus gave, or sermon that Jesus gave. So anyway, just another example. One more is Isaiah 52 before we go on to something different, something completely different. In Isaiah 52, now Isaiah 53 we're all familiar with, right? That's the suffering servant passage. We know that well because we read it every Easter. But I wonder if you've ever noticed this. This is interesting. Go ahead and why don't you read just chapter 53, verses 1 through, let's do 3 that we're very familiar with. Go ahead and just read that the way that we're used to hearing
53, it. 1 through 3. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up from him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem.
So we call this the suffering servant passage, right? So you have this idea of the one who comes. Look back in chapter 52, and I want you to start with verse 13, okay? Here, you go ahead and read it. You're doing a good job reading there.
See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand.
And then it goes on, who has believed our message, right?
Yeah.
So it's this idea of seeing and hearing, and then it goes on, and it talks about this servant. So he's introduced, actually, the servant is actually introduced up in chapter 52, verse 13. And again, an example probably where, and think about it, we've heard this, we've seen it printed on Easter cards. We've probably seen it hung up in people's homes, just this passage. But it probably, again, as the prophet was originally given it, probably part of a larger discourse. Something to pay attention to. I'm not saying every chapter is this way. We're giving you some examples of where it seems to be a very clear example. But always look beyond those. Don't let those numbers and those chapter breaks keep you from reading the whole section together.
That's good.
Do you want to do the Philippians thing that you're talking about now?
Let's kind of started this conversation. Brian was asking me,
what'd you learn?
Well, what we learned, but what should we talk about?
Right.
And hint, if you're listening, we'd love to hear what you'd like to hear about.
Yeah.
This is a time for us. So one of the things that going through the class is, what are the questions you have? What are the things that you see? And I'll admit this, in Philippians chapter 1, we have Paul explaining to the church in Philippi why he's in chains. And I'll start this. This is with verse 12. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Chapter break.
Mm-hmm.
It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. And so when we were given this assignment, one of the things we said we had to do with a clean copy of Philippians, as you said, and you write it out and say, like, what questions do you have? Or what questions do you think they have? Or anything like that. And one of my questions was, my eye was taken there by the chapter break here in 15. Like, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. And I thought, who are these people?
Right.
It seemed like a totally disconnected thought to me.
Right.
And then we did some of the paragraph work here. Now I'm going to read it a little bit differently.
Okay.
Starting with 14 again. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill.
Right.
And so I when reading it without that chapter break, I kind of go, some of the brothers
are the ones
are the some that are preaching out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill.
Right.
So in my mind, as I was working through Philippians, I thought, who are these outside? Is it someone that's just trying to stir up trouble for Paul?
Right.
But it seems to be like, no, while he's in chains, it has encouraged some. It's encouraged everyone, but some have been encouraged to preach out of goodwill, and some have been encouraged to preach out of envy and rivalry.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And so just how much that paragraph break. Yeah. Because for me, I pause. It's a new thought. It's a new thought.
You're taught in first, second grade to pay attention to those paragraph breaks. And so that's why I think it, like you said, visually, it becomes such a part of our reading strategy. Another thing, it's good to read out loud sometimes maybe and see what you come up with in those things as well. So So yeah, that's great. Was there anything else you had in Philippians, or was that
yeah?
that was the main one?
That was the main thing that kind of stuck out to me, because it changes how, instead of me trying to shadowy figures out there that are trying to get Paul, but it's like, no, it's even from some that he knows,
some insiders that are part of this. Yeah.
And as you we look through this, like, we know that the church in Philippi gave Paul money for his ministry, and so maybe this envy and rivalry comes from a financial standpoint,
saying,
that like, well,
why is Paul getting paid? We should get paid too,
because we're preaching like him now. We're bold now. We're like him, and we're preaching, so we should be supported like he was.
So kind of how we feel about other podcasts that get a lot of support.
Yeah, yeah.
We're doing this out of envy and rivalry. Okay.
Yes.
I get it.
No, that was just one of the things for me is, and I know we've talked about this before, and I said, when we talked about this topic, I'm like, I know we've kind of alluded to this, but there's just some of these ways that we read stuff. And again, reading, I've become more attuned to the oral nature here, that we need to be listening to some of this, and how in hearing we can detect more of the narrative sometimes than in the reading.
And we try to point this out sometimes. I can think about sometimes we've mentioned, sometimes there's puns on the words. Sometimes there's a repeated sound that you have in these words, and we try to point that out when we're looking through some of these passages that we're teaching. Again, this is why sometimes you got to look just a little bit deeper beyond the surface, to kind of get the full sense of what the writer is saying in these. Well, finally, one last thing, and then we'll talk a little bit about some strategies, I think, to work on this. Colossians chapter 1. Now, I mentioned earlier, Colossians 1 is a notoriously difficult sentence structure, because my logos shut down, just so you know.
Oh, that's all right. I've got it.
I've got it back up, but it's messed up what I had. But anyway, when you compare Colossians 1 again with the Greek text, and looking what the Greek is in this case, it's quite a bit different in two different areas. So the first one I wanted to look at was basically Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. I'll go ahead and read it, and then can you follow along in the Greek? Are you watching that in the Greek?
Yeah.
Okay. For this reason, since the day we heard about you, this is the way it is in the NIV, and I'm going to read the whole sentence here. For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so you may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father, who's qualified you to share in the inheritance of the holy people in the kingdom of light, period. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of times in English translations, they take a long Greek sentence and they divide it into several shorter ones. What's interesting here is that they've blown right through a full stop, or a period, we would call it in English, a full stop in the Greek text, at least the Nestle Allen 28 Greek text. So here's more or less how it reads here. Make sure I'm doing this right. So back in verse 9 again, I'll actually pick up the last half of verse 9. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so you may have great endurance and patience, period. Okay. Yep. And then it goes on, giving thanks with great joy, or with joy, to the Father who's qualified you. So again, there's a break here. Now there's clearly a connection in thought, but it's interesting to me that they made this sound like those are parallel then, right? So you've got being strengthened, and great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks, all would be parallel if we saw this in the English, where it seems like that the great endurance and patience is the end, and then it's a new thought,
right,
with giving joyful thanks to the Father. So just
there's no chi there. There's no chi and in the Greek. Yeah,
there's no indication in the Greek that there should be a new sentence here. So if you go back then, one other passage that I noticed in this is a similar kind of thing. It's down in verses 14 and 15. Let's start with 13. He's rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins, period. Okay. And even in my edition that I'm looking at here, there's a space, there's a break here. But there's what's called in Greek a high point here, a semicolon. Right. So this is at least the way the Nestle Allen editors see this, all as one thought. For he's rescued us from the dominion of darkness, brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. The Son is the image of the invisible God. So you see I'm saying this idea of the dominion of darkness, and he's bringing us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. And so here this idea of the Son is the image of the invisible God seems to fit more closely together with that previous thought than what it looks like in the edition that we have. So maybe you guys have some that you've noticed as well. Send us a note. We can talk about this again if there's a lot of them. Those are just some examples we have. Yeah. So again, just to repeat, sometimes it's bad chapter breaks. Sometimes it's bad paragraph breaks. Yes. Sometimes it's bad section breaks. So what do we do? What are some suggestions that you have for how to combat this?
Well, I think it just depends on what you're doing. You know what I mean? Sure. Like, I think a reader Bible does help in some of this stuff. But as we mentioned, it still has its own artificial chapter breaks in it. So it comes with its own thing. If you're really doing a deep dive in, I think it's, you can find places online where you can copy the text out and put it in a Word document and take out all the chapter mark and just read it. Yeah. It doesn't take as much time as you think it's going to take for you to do that. I think that's one thing. I use Logos all the time. And as we were getting ready to start this, because we were talking about chapter breaks, I'm like, I've got to change the formating. Yeah. Because you have yours turned off. I have mine changed so that it just puts every verse on its new line. And so sometimes I'm like, I've gotten to the point now when I'm studying or I'm in a text, I know the verse marks are artificial as well, but I'm not seeing those chapter breaks as they are in the Bible. So I think it's one of those things to do that. But I think even with the Bibles I do have is to read large sections and to think through that. It's almost to the point I've come to the point I'm like, whenever I see a break, I got to ask myself, how does what's coming after that break or before that break, how do they go together? Yeah. Like how are they tied together? Or, it's always the word therefore is a huge. Yeah. I was going to say there are some big words. There are some big words that do indicate what's the word I would say is logical connections. Therefore is an example of this. However, there are some big examples like that where there's clear breaks. Now there's still a logical connection. Therefore usually suggests what something connection with what comes before. But yeah, I think read through and think through what is the logical connection here. We're just so used to reading in Scripture discrete sections, and our worship encourages this, right? The preacher brings out 6 verses or whatever, and that's our text for today. But it's always good to look. We always talk about the importance of context. One of the rules of thumb that I've taught for years is the smaller the section of Scripture you're looking at, the more important the larger context becomes. So if you're only looking at a verse or two, you've got to bring in the rest of the context. Is what it comes down to. But anyway, just some ideas there. I was going to say we're big fans of Logos. You fretted about buying it for a long time because it is an investment. Yes. But it is a powerful tool that gives you lots of different kinds of options. It's not for everybody. What I would say is if you're not a person who's going to use something like Logos, though, reading multiple versions. I know again that's asking a lot, but especially if you're doing some study for Sunday school or prepare a lesson, or you really want to know something, look at multiple English translations. And a lot of times when you notice differences there, and this is basically what the exercise you're doing in class, when you notice those differences, it's calling your attention, even differences in wording, it calls your attention, hey, there may be something here I need to think about. I need to think through this. And so sometimes that can help as well. I mentioned earlier reading orally, and I think reading aloud sometimes we're not used to that. We read silently, even listening to the Bible sometimes. A good version of the Bible, listening to that
you might notice some things in listening that you might not catch otherwise as well. Some connections and some repeated phrases and that kind of thing. We looked at the wrath of God being revealed and the righteousness of God being revealed in Romans chapter 1 not too long ago, for example. Those kind of things that might come to the surface if you hear it read out loud. So,
yeah. Well, good. All right. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here in actually face to face in the Bistro East. So
yeah. So there's more to come. We're not.
No.
I know we've kind of been a little bit more sporadic this year, just because. Again, I'm
busy.
in school. We're busy. I'm in school. You're in school. We do care about this, and we hope you do too. And so, if you're enjoying the podcast and you think something's helpful, please share it. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or things that are rolling around in your head that maybe this conversation sparked or anything else you've listened to, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. You can also support us. You can go to thebiblebistro.com. There's a button at the top where you can support us monthly there if you'd like. Or there's a little bookstore on our website as well that's recommended resources.
We'll add the Reader's Bible, I think would be a good thing to add to this library. As we talk about different things, we add it to those resources. And if you have resources you wonder about, let us know. And as we think through that, we always add those to the library as well.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And
we'll
see you again soon.
All right.
Bye.